Welcome back to another episode of Building Confidence. And this one was almost a no brainer for me when my guest today, Max Kaufmann, reached out. He reached out to me a few years ago and he built some of these really cool underspin style jigs. And he sent us some along with a couple conventional jigs, bucktail that he builds. I looked at them, I'm like, hey, these are really cool. But being that we fish in Northwestern Ontario. I'm not gonna lie, they looked smallish. I didn't really know where to use it or how to use it. And I'm gonna be totally honest, we didn't play around with them a whole bunch. We did use them very sparingly, and it was one of the ones that, again, I'm just gonna be honest, we kind of forgot about. But over the past couple years, they've been showing up in different areas. I'm seeing them on social media, and recently my buddy Matt Vavrock had Max on, and Brian Scaife, another good buddy, and Rich Reiner talked about your jigs. And when Max reached out, because he'll be doing the Wausau show in a few weeks, as of the time of this recording, I thought this is a perfect opportunity to come on Building Confidence and tell me what I was doing wrong and tell the viewers what they could expect. So welcome to Building Confidence, Max.
Well, thank you, Glenn. I can't thank you enough for having me on. I mean, it's an honor, honestly. And we're just a small business out of Colorado, and to have viewers all the way in Canada or the Midwest is just unreal, honestly. And the fact that when I look at even just my shipping list from people buying stuff off of my website, it's unbelievable how far this reach really is. So, yeah, I mean, I get that a lot. Some people just go, I don't know where in my arsenal that this would fit because they're just not used to that style. And, like it has, I will say, these baits are on the smaller side as far as profile is concerned. So therefore, and people for example, in your neck of the woods, whether it be Canada, the things like that, they're, may be overlooked in some way, but in all reality, they definitely have their place. And uh, I know, and for example, like even in the Minnesota area, I don't sell a ton of baits because people are used to seeing these giant baits. And in all reality, a medium to smaller size bait definitely has its time. There's no doubt about that. Especially in conditions where you may want to throw a bigger bait, and you move a big fish. It may not be a bad idea to come back on that fish with a smaller bait to get a different look.
Yeah, I'm just going to cut in right there because we just recently did a video on the most overlooked bucktails in musky fishing, and that's that double eight, single six, single seven, down to like the old classic MEPS number 5. And so many people have had success with just a simple MEPS number 5. And I have one of your small little bucktail jigs here, and that is not really a lot different size profile than a MEPS number 5, or think of some of the original MEPS musky
Yep.
killers. And people have made careers on those baits. So to think that they're small, that's a little bit naive on our part, certainly on my part. I do think musky anglers in general, there's been this trend to push bigger, 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 and it's almost fresh and unconventional to think small again. And I do think that there's a place in every musky market or area, however you want to say it, for these smaller, almost finesse style baits. Is that fair to say that this would be more of a finesse style bait,
The
Max?
jigs would be, yeah, absolutely the jigs.
Yeah.
Um, and the way that I originally fished the underspin, or I call it the kook spin, um, that is, the way I originally started fishing it. Yes, that's finesse. But the way that I've learned, yes, that one, and the way that I've learned to fish that one, it is completely different and not as finessey. And I don't know everything. Just because I build the darn thing doesn't mean that I know the best way to fish it right off the gate, right? We all have, there's always going to be a learning curve there. And to go back to the jigs for a second, I originally designed them for lake trout fishing. They were originally designed for ice fishing lake trout. Up here in Colorado, we have a ton of fantastic lake trout fisheries, and I used to live on a lake trout lake, and so they originally were designed for that. But the more I started building them, the more musky guys I worked with, and the more shows that I thought about going to, I started kind of messing with putting blades on the rear, big rubber tails, and all that kind of good stuff to chase muskies with. And I started fishing using them for muskies up here because our fish are a pain in the butt to get to eat. They're just very well fed. And we have a ton of big muskies, like an unreal amount of big muskies. It's just, they're almost impossible to catch. They are just unreal hard to catch. So a lot of times to be most successful, you do have to be a little finessey with it and think unconventionally from what you would normally think about an average musky bait to throw for the day. When I was in Wisconsin in June, I turned 30 in June, and so I made a musky trip out to Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin, and I was fishing with Gus Manti for a couple days, and he taught me a way to fish my underspin that I didn't even ever think about doing, because in Colorado we just don't fish that way. It's just not something I ever thought about doing. And for somebody in Wisconsin, that might be a no-brainer to fish that way. It just wasn't. It didn't occur to me. And that was, basically just ripping it, just like a bulldog. And I mean, honestly, that's the best way to describe it. It's a fast bulldog. And if that, I don't know where that would fit into your way of fishing or other people's, but we were fishing really deep because that's my confidence. Out here in Colorado, I'm used to fishing structure that you can't see with your eyes. And even though we're fishing, 20 feet of water, you get out here in Colorado, like there's some lakes you might be able to see that structure. But the deeper water, more than likely, you have an actual shot at catching a fish instead of in the shallows a lot of the time where they're just a lot more weary. And so when I was in Wisconsin, he understood that, being the guy that he is, he's awesome. And he realized that, this kid is a lot more confident in deeper water. Let's go fish some deep water. And so we did. And we moved a bunch of fish. And the cool thing was I ended up getting my first Wisconsin muskie on this little guy, And what was funny about that was, honestly, it was a small muskie. It was only maybe 26 inches, but there was a 40 plus right behind it all the way to the boat. And that was pretty cool, right? But it was just one of those things that I never even thought about. It didn't occur to me to do it that way because I had no confidence fishing it that way. I had never done it. All I had ever done in Colorado with it was straight retrieve, and then every now and again, just move your rod tip left to right and rip, and then continue straight retrieving it. And it did really well that way. It never occurred to me that was going to be the way to do it.
Yeah, I just want to again cut in there because there's a lot to unpack. And Gus he's really becoming one of the premier musky anglers, certainly in the Midwest. And it's interesting that he would, use your bait in a style that maybe you didn't think of, but that's again going to the strengths of a guide on a particular body of water, kind of knowing where the fish are going to be. And for us, taking that, well, as soon as you said trout fishing, I'm like, okay, next time I go for Lakers here through the ice, I'm going to take one of these just to try. So that was interesting enough. Like that was already worth the conversation, but I want to try them in some of that bulldog, pit bull, even where we'd use like a mini Medusa, stuff like that. I can already see. And there's a couple of your videos where you're dragging that underspin, kind of bouncing it over the rocks there. And it's a case of that video shows so much more in 10 seconds than you and I can describe.
Absolutely.
Because it's really easy for viewers to see visually. Oh, now I'm seeing what's happening. I think in a lot of cases, people think of a hair jig or, even an underspin jig is almost more of an open water style lure. You're fishing off a structure. Don't typically think of it as a make contact with structure type of bait, but in your video, when you're making contact with structure with it, to me, that opens up that style of lure to a whole different area of fishing that I wouldn't have otherwise thought of. If you can drag one of these jigs and you're just making contact, and up here with the walleye and the bass fishing, when you make contact with a jig on the bottom, you get that little puff of sand and
Yep.
silt that comes up. The fish tune into it, and we're starting to see that with muskies jigging Bondy baits, jigging tubes. Jigging is becoming a very viable option for musky fishermen up here, albeit it's not one that a lot of guys employ. We started doing it a little bit more the past couple of years. Your lure seems to fit that bill. And if it's a time when fish are neutral, negative, I think the finesse aspect of bouncing like your little underspin, and this one's actually it's a pretty good size. Like that's not small by any standards.
No. So the way that this is going to sound, I mean, again, this is supposed to be a musky podcast, right? Or more like an interview, right? I do a lot of pike guiding. I do. And here in Colorado, we have a ton of giant pike, just giant. And the reality is a lot of times those big pike, they're wanting to, they like to hang next to like a 20-foot drop off, right? And it's a giant, the lake that I fish, there's well, two of the lakes that I fish, they have these giant weed flats with 20-foot drop offs, and so the way that I would fish it a lot for those pike, which I have gotten a lot of tigers because there are tigers in that lake doing this. That would be essentially walking it down the break line, if that makes sense, right?
Yep.
And getting this bait, and especially a blade bait, in the face of a fish that probably doesn't see blades hardly ever, and that seemed to be very viable option for me, especially when I'm guiding to try to, when I'm guiding, a lot of it is, experimenting to see where the big ones are hanging out depth wise for the day and for the time of the day. A lot of that obviously is weather driven. And so on a sunny day, I'm going to fish those deeper weed edges just for the fact that more than likely those big giant females are hanging out a little bit deeper, shading themselves in those big giant weed patches. That's normally what I would do with it. But the one thought that I had, I'm sorry, I want to kind of go back just for a second for you. You were talking about the disturbance in the water, right, with the jigs and making almost like a poof of sand, poof of mud, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's originally what that was designed for, what these were designed for lake trout fishing. But
Yep.
that's why I use this head. So this is a worm nose, right? Rich and I have named this little guy the Beach Boy head because that's what we use it for. And this guy would be more of my swimming head, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so unfortunately, I only get that head in one weight, and that's the 3/4 ounce as of yet. So it's a lot lighter. But in all reality, that's what that is originally designed for. And I will say out here in the springtime, like ice off, it's glide baits and that bad boy. Like that's really, because we don't have a season for muskies, because our muskies don't really spawn. They're all stocked. And so therefore, as soon as that ice comes off and the boat ramps open, you can fish for muskies, no problem. And the reality is like that sand bite is so unbelievable. And last year, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, it's gonna sound stupid. I had a muskie bite a hole in a blade. Like they literally, like these things literally just inhale them. But one thing I did learn from other fishermen, this idea actually came from Matt Vavrock. It never occurred to me because there was a lot of guys that were worried about the muskies biting the blades. And sometimes, and just like I just said, they do. There is chances they do. Normally they suck it up in. But there is times where you may pull it away as soon as they go to bite because you don't know when a muskie's going to bite a lot of the times, right?
Yep.
And so essentially just adding a trailer hook, that's all you got to do. And some guys even go and put a small zip tie on it, even onto that main wire. That will, in a sense, take away a little bit of the vibration and walking from the blade a little bit, but not enough to really matter. You could easily put a trailer hook on there if you're worried at all about a fish short striking it. But what I did learn from Rich, and this was something that he made me aware of when he started talking about musky fishing, musky jigs in general, was using too heavy of a rod. One thing with jig fishing too is a lot of guys tend to use too big of rods, and so therefore you end up pulling the bait out of the fish's mouth a lot of the times. And so therefore, obviously keeping incredibly sharp hooks is important, but on top of that, using a lighter action rod to give it a little give when you actually do hook up with that fish, because a lot of times you'll end up, like I said, pulling the bait out of their mouth, which it sounds crazy, but that's what happens. And so therefore, using a super heavy bass flipping stick, that's what I would suggest. Essentially what most people would consider a downsizer rod, right? Even a surgical strike from Chaos is literally too heavy. It may be on that cusp of being too heavy, maybe with my new jig that I just came out, like a new weight of jig that I just came out with, maybe that would be fine. But in all reality, I prefer basically a bass flip and stick with a 300 series reel. That's what I would use.
That musky anglers as a whole, we've pushed the boundaries of how heavy of a rod we want to use all the time and seemingly get away with. I do think that there's a big segment of the musky market that is not using the right gear for the right lures. That's not something we're going to solve in a half hour conversation. That's a broader issue, and we see it with smaller bucktails, with smaller glide baits, with smaller dive and rise. It's so easy to overpower a lure with a big rod, a big reel, big equipment, big leaders. I've talked about it a lot on building confidence, matching your gear to the lure, because you designed this to work with a certain setup.
Yep.
Now, if I throw this underspin on a Thorn extra heavy 10-foot, I'm just doing you a disservice, because even if I do get a strike, in all likelihood, I'm gonna force that fish in. And on a smaller finesse lure like this, you're just, again, you're not doing yourself the right service by using heavy gear. So now that you kind of mentioned the rod size or action size of the rod, what type of leader for these underspins and for your jigs specifically? And then let's talk about, I know you got a couple newer baits coming, but what type of leader, what type of line are you using for your jigs specifically?
So there's two things there, right? So underspins and jigs, I use different setups. I do. So the reality is, for jigs, I'm usually fishing 49 strand wire, usually about a 12-inch leader. And I do like a split ring, but recently what's becoming a lot more popular, because jigs tend to have smaller eyelets, right? And this was actually something that when I originally started talking with you, you had brought this up to me. And I've now fixed that problem. It's not a problem anymore. And it wasn't necessarily a problem. It was just something that it didn't really occur to me. I use these fast attach connections. And then, so a lot of times, especially these come stock on my underspins, but with jigs, I like to just have a fast attach connection, or you could split ring directly to the eyelet itself if you feel confident doing that as well. Some, out here in Colorado, a lot of our musky anglers are novices because they're just not used to it. So having just a simple and fast attach, they can connect to all sorts of baits, no problem. It's real quick and easy for them. And so I started doing that and was like, wow, okay, that's a viable option. I personally don't like it on the jigs just because it's more metal than what needs to be there. In all reality, a split ring and a 49 strand wire is more than fine. That I love that 49 strand wire. It has some recoil. It's flexible. All that stuff is awesome. So a 12-inch leader for that. I usually pair. I'm a fins guy. I like fins braid. It's my favorite so far. And so I use for the jigs. I usually use 60 to 80 pound XS. Was it XS big game? I think so. Yeah. Yeah,
I believe
and
so. Yeah.
that's what I like. And for the underspins, I will go a little heavier, just because you're moving it so much faster. You're giving it a lot more force. First off, with the rod, I definitely would throw that with, at a minimum, the tactical. Really, like in the chaos lineup, I would probably use the tactical strike or even a swat with that 9 foot, 9'6" type of rod, and that's fairly heavy. That's not crazy heavy. It ain't no Moab, but like in all reality, it's a relatively decent setup for that. A little bit of give, but still has a lot of backbone to it. A great rod for that. And I would again use in dirtier water, I'd be using 49 strand wire, or if I'm ripping above weed beds and stuff, 49 strand wire with a split ring on it, because those baits come stock with the fast attach connection on them, and then I crimp the fast attach so it will never come off. But in all reality, that's what I use. But here in Colorado, or that's what I would use. But here in Colorado, we fish a lot of, not in that lake in particular where I'm chasing those big muskies. I don't fish a ton of weed beds. It's mostly rock and rock drop offs, and shelves. And in that case, I'm fishing fluorocarbon. I know people are going to hate me when I say that, but I'll fish 175-pound fluorocarbon, and that's heavy as all get out. Yes, there's still a chance you could break off, but it's relatively unlikely. It definitely could happen. There's you just pay attention to your leader, make sure it doesn't get all messed up, and if it does, change it. But we're talking gin clear water, and yes, and these fish see a lot of baits, and this, especially because this lake isn't very big, it's maybe 400 acres, maybe, it's very small. And so therefore, these fish do see a lot of baits. So I just try to reduce the amount of metal and things like that in the water as much as possible. And it seems to be effective. But yeah, I mean, that's really what I'd use for that. And my new bait, I would probably use, or I do use 49 strand wire, just in case, because they tend to inhale it.
All right, let's transition this to that newer bait you got coming out. You sent me, looks really cool, moves a ton of water. It's an conventional style.
Yeah,
That's maybe the easiest way to put it. I didn't expect it when I clicked on the video. Show the viewers if you have one handy. I'll run the video here as well. I just think this is a unique take on something that I'm kind of surprised nobody's really done something super similar.
So the reality, Glenn, is that I didn't come up with this idea. I'm going to be completely honest. I'm one of the most honest dudes that I know, right? And I will say that I didn't come up with this idea. The Japanese did. A lot. That's the truth. The Japanese did in the bass fishing world. I just made it big. That's all I did. And to be honest, I don't even agree with what they call it. So I had to come up with my new name for it. So this bait I do call the floozy. It's a cross between, I'll just show you guys. It is a cross between kind of like a spinnerbait and a chatterbait all in one. The beautiful part about this bait is that it, like you said, it moves a ton of water, but it has two forms of sound. And the reason for that is that because there's so much pull on this, and it kind of has a springing action, essentially, when you rip this bait, the blade will smack the head. I don't know if you can see that, but it smacks it so hard that it literally chips and dents and takes chunks out of the lead. And so this bait, as I'm sure you saw in the video, you can hear it before you see it. And it comes, and that's fairly clear water. I mean, that water, if you were swimming, and you could see quite a ways. And it's unbelievably clear water. And you can hear it before you even see it, which is nuts. And
Yeah.
in those videos, I do make a chatterbait as well. I don't usually bring that to the show, to the Wisconsin Muskie Expo, and I don't plan on to this year or nothing. I normally sell it here in my shop, but uh, we did not a side by side comparison, but we did a shot, a shot with the chatterbait, and we did a shot with the new floozy. And I will say that it's not even in comparison the sound. It's completely different.
Hmm.
And I started being really intrigued by underwater footage. I'm not gonna lie, because of y'all's videos, and like that was something years ago that I was like, that's really cool. I need to do more of that. And when I started doing that little pond, but close to us, we started going up there and throwing this around, and it was like, holy cow, man, this is unbelievable. And so then I started throwing. I normally test baits for a couple of years. This one was only tested for about a year and a half, something like that. And the reality is that it put so many fish in my boat, unbelievable amount of fish in my boat, mostly pike because that's what I'm guiding for. But we did catch lots of tigers on them, and there was a couple big, decent size, not big, but decent sized muskies caught in Wisconsin on them. I just think it's a different take, and the beautiful part is that it's basically a chatterbait you can fish at any depth with just a simple modification or tune. And that's the cool part
Hmm.
about it. And I make this in a 3/4 ounce, an ounce, and a 2 ounce. And so the 2 ounce, you can fish essentially in 30 feet of water if you wanted to, which you probably wouldn't. You'd probably fish in 20, 25 feet of water to be safe. But the reality
Hmm.
is like that's what I'm doing in the spring a lot of times too for those big pike is normally you would throw like a glide bait or something or even a swim bait for them when it's cold. You can now put something like this and run and just creep it really, really, really slow along those deep weed edges, and they just come and inhale it. The thing is like it's when people buy them from me at the show, they're gonna run as I sell them. They're gonna run fairly deep, and with as you know, with every spinner bait, you're always gonna have to tune it from left to right. That's just how wires are. You are gonna have to tune it. There's almost no ifs ands or buts about it. Just because if I throw these in the water and try to tune them myself, the tinsel will stick together, and then before you know it, they just look like crap. So it's
Hmm.
very very simple tunes, but the tune that I do to it to make it run faster is I actually bend the tip of the blade, and that way, that simple modification will allow you to fish this thing. And well, that, and I also bend the wire further down to create less drag, and so therefore you can fish this thing in inches of water, just absolutely crazy, crazy shallow, and you can burn it. That's the cool part. But also, if you see a fish following your lure, give it a couple smacks with your rod tip, and that blade will not only go from chattering like this to then smacking that head and make a knocking sound, and you wouldn't believe how many times that turns the fish on, and they just eat. So yeah, I mean, there's no magical bait, right? I don't have magic pixie dust to put on them, but I thought it was a really cool idea. It was something I saw online a few years ago, and I searched and searched and searched on the internet to try to find one, and I couldn't find any. I couldn't find any in the U.S. even, right? I couldn't find any that were even available in Japan. That were like, but they're the ones they were making they were bass size and snakehead size. They were
Yeah.
not meant for that original design was not meant for muskies and pike. But I used to sell products to Shields in Colorado Springs and the Johnstown Shields, and when I did that, I had I have a ton of spinnerbait frames and was like, that would be a good use of those. Let's try that out. And so I started messing with it, and I was so freaking blown away. It wasn't even funny. And this year, not only did it get my personal best pike on it, I had a couple of my clients get their personal best on it, so that was pretty awesome. And it's cool, And I think that the nice part about it is it does allow the customer to kind of use the bait. All of my baits do this, but allow slight modifications, allow them to fish a bait in a lot of different scenarios. It's not just this is how you reel in a bucktail. It's
Hmm.
completely different than that. Whether you're fishing, and it was a really nice fit for the lineup because, you have jigs for neutral and negative fish. You have your underspins for, your neutral to slightly active fish, if that makes sense. Or
Hmm.
even if you jig them along, I guess that could be negative fish. And now you have this floozy for active fish. And it's so when people come into my booth, they're able to go, well, crap, that's all their moods. That
Yeah.
a muskie's got three moods, so that's all their
That's
moods.
no, that's interesting. And chatterbaits, obviously in the bass world, they're amazing. Like everybody
Hmm.
catches fish on chatterbaits. It's one of our favorite bass baits in the spring up here in northwestern Ontario. Chatterbaits have been popular in musky fishing. TNA Tackle makes a great one. A bunch of other companies make some. Probably the most common is the TNA. However, they never really seem to take off like a bucktail. It's not to say that they're not successful because they are, but it's not one of those things that people are instantly
Yep.
reaching for, kind of like your jigs. And I think it just takes time. It takes confidence, building confidence in a style of lure. Certainly, we're going to try more. I'm going to ask you a couple questions here as we do wrap up. But one other thing I want you to kind of talk about is when you go to your website, you have conventional bucktails on there as well. I know you sent me some a few years ago. Just touch on those because that is part of what you're building as
Yep.
well, right, Max?
So I make, like I'm sure you saw on my website, I make all sorts of stuff. I don't just make musky tackle.
Yeah.
As I'm here in my tackle shop, right? I have to kind of cater for a lot of different fishermen. So I make everything from trout spinners to musky stuff, And the reality is that I make musky bucktails, buzz baits, spinner baits, chatter baits, freaking floozies now, jigs, underspins. And the only thing right now I don't make is, oh, I do make soft plastics too, but not really for the musky world. That's it. Being where I live, we have such a variety of fish that you have to kind of cater to that. So I make these awesome trout jigs that guys use for walleye, smallmouth bass. I used to fish on the bass tour when I was a teenager on the BASS and FLW. We'd fish for smallmouth all the time, and we'd buy these hair jigs that were just absolutely garbage, but they would catch fish, but they would fall apart. And so after lots and lots and lots of trial and error, I finally figured out the material, and these baits don't fall apart. And I think that's the one thing to kind of take away from any small batch manufacturer, right? Is the fact that these guys put a lot of passion into their products, and more than likely, don't hold me to that, but more than likely they're going to last longer than stuff that you're going to find from a big box store. And I think, as we all know, things these days aren't exactly getting any cheaper. And so, buy once, cry once in my world is becoming more and more just that's what you do,
Yeah.
And so that's actually the origin story of cougar baits in general. Up here in Colorado, we don't. I live 3 hours from Denver. I'm deep in the mountains, and the reality is that we don't have tackle shops. I mean, we do now. I'm the only tackle shop for literally hours. And the thing is that uh, when I first started, making jigs, or before I even started making jigs, we were going to these small gas station tackle shops. And
Mhm.
the thing is that we were buying junk. Like that's all you could buy was absolute junk, and it would just fall apart. And it was like, what in the world am I spending my money on? This is just absolutely terrible. And so at that same time, I was starting a business, didn't have a bunch of money, and so I was sitting in my apartment, going ice fishing all the time. And the reality was that I sat there and just built and built and built until I came up with something that I thought was kind of cool, which was the original hair jigs. And the thing was is that we started crushing lake trout on them, and before you know it, more buddies wanted them, stores wanted them, and it all piled from necessity. And it was literally, I didn't have the money to go and buy, a pack of tubes every couple of weeks. Like I just didn't have it. I was poor, and so
Hmm.
the reality is that I needed to build something that, yes, it may cost a little more up front, but I'm going to use this all season long. What does it matter? That's why, in my world at that time, I used a lot of spoons for lake trout because it's a Lakers. What are you going to replace a hook? It's a spoon. It's a giant piece of
Yeah.
metal. So that was the thing, and now I do. It's the same way, and I try to build stuff as hardy as I can, because that's the name that I've built here in Colorado. A lot of other places in this world may obviously have no idea who I am and what my products are, but the reality is I've built a name here in Colorado of being the guy that builds quality products. They may not always, you're definitely not gonna. They're not the cheapest ones in the world, that's for darn sure. But there's so much love and time that goes into every single one, and I think that's what sets, like a lot of small batch manufacturers apart from the average guy, and I've learned that from the Wisconsin Muskie Expo. When I walk through those aisles and talk to these guys, like, I mean, heck, some of these guys are like, their day jobs, they're actual engineers, and these guys are out thinking outside the box, and they're putting it into, you know they're dreaming up their perfect bait and putting it into action and being able to sell it. And if that's not passion, I don't know what is. And the thing is like these guys
Hmm.
are just so talented, and I wish more people, and I know that it's starting to, would give them a shot. It's not just my stuff; it's everyone's. Whether you're talking hard baits or soft baits, or if you're talking hair jigs, right? I hope that more people will actually start gravitating to the small batch world, just because, man, these guys, they're putting their heart and soul into these things, and on top of that, they last forever. So there's nothing more,
Yeah.
there's nothing better than that, in my opinion.
As we wrap this one up, Max, which ones of your bait should I be throwing more in 2025?
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot there. Just rattling in my head. What's the best ones to throw? It sounds like you definitely need a hair jig that with a blunt nose, right? Because like what Brian Scape was saying, I know the rusty crayfish population isn't, and especially an eagle is definitely
Hmm.
exploding. So maybe that would be something you definitely should have, uh, in whether it be a brown color or, you know, essentially a crayfish color. Is what you'd probably be looking for there. Uh, I personally would suggest my brand new underspin. Uh, and I guess I should have mentioned this earlier. I just released a new model of my underspin, which you don't have. And
Hmm.
that is the longer hook hanger. So that video that I'm sure you saw with the perch underspin, I
Yep.
extended the hook hanger, and actually the wire goes all the way down into the collar of the bait to make it even more secure. And but I can only make that an ounce and a half. And if you're going to be fishing any of that deep, clear water, that might be a good option for you. Otherwise, obviously, the ounce. I would 100% suggest. I mean, honestly, these are great options too. But if you don't like the hair jig, I also make a tinsel jig too, as well. This could be a good viable option for you as well. It just depends on the profile that you're looking for and how close to that rusty crayfish color you're trying to get. Because there's definitely limitations. There's always going to be limitations with materials. But I really like, more than anything, I would highly suggest the floozy. Um, I would have said my chatterbait before, but when you're talking fish and shallow weeds, but honestly, now that I've been using this bait more and more and more, those would be the three that I would pick 100%. Probably, I mean, I fell in love with black and silver since I started watching your channel, and you started using. Was it the jailbird, or what do you call that?
The silver jailbird.
Yeah, yeah. Once I started throwing silver and black, it kind of clicked in my head because we were always using black spinner baits with silver blades, and was like, what in the heck am I doing here? Let's just converge the two. I don't know why I didn't think of that. Let's just make a bait that's like this, and and it has to be an orange tail for some reason. I mean, it has to be. Otherwise, they just give you the middle finger, you know. So like, yeah, that would be what I would suggest. You know, you definitely need a jig. You definitely need an underspin, and you definitely need one of those new baits. I mean, those are three. You could pretty much go fishing in a lot of different settings. You're not going to fill all the gaps, but you're going to get at least halfway there on any day out of the water with those three baits. You know.
Nice. So for all of the viewers that are going to see this just prior to the Wausau show, you just heard it here straight from Max. Go to his booth, pick up those three baits, talk to him, get an idea of what you're going to need for your home waters. That's always key as well. And now that we've seen some of these underwater, we've heard from you, we should be able to go into the season with a lot more confidence. I know behind the scenes, I'm going to get some of these new baits coming our way. I'll get them in the water for some of our underwater footage. And I certainly want to get that floozy underwater and do some filming, ripping that thing so we can show our viewers that blade hitting just and doing some tweaks on it. I think that falls right in line with what a lot of guys like to do. They like a bait that they can do different things with, maybe tweak it here, tweak it there, something that's going to fit a broad sweet spot within the market with just three baits. And I urge all the viewers to at least give these a shot. And I'll kind of say what I said at the beginning. I do apologize. I didn't try these or I didn't give these enough time. Let's hook back up again in the future. And hopefully we have some success stories from my half and see what else you have cooking up as you go through this season. So thank you. Best of luck. Tell folks where they can find you online.
I do have a website. Also have socials as well. I got Facebook and Instagram. My Facebook would be Cougar Baits Fish and Lures, and my Instagram is Cougar Baits LLC. My website is cougarbaitsfishinglures.com. If the fastest way for anybody in Wisconsin would be to just stop by my booth. I know that may be asking a lot, but it's a wonderful show and it's a great weekend for a family too.
Look forward to having you back on. I look forward to getting a couple of your new baits in my home waters, and hopefully I'm going to gain some confidence with it. So for the viewers, for myself, and for Max, thank you guys so much. This has been another edition of Building Confidence.
Thank you.